University of Limerick. And in today's presentation, my presentation is basically about low carbon transition in rural Ghana. That's what I'll be talking to you about today. And there's going to be the outline. I'll start by giving a global outlook of energy access. So when I talk of energy, I'll be referring to electricity and cooking fuel. And I'll talk about the disparities in the global access to energy and narrow it down to energy access in Ghana, where I talk about electricity, cooking fuel, and then the rural-urban divide in energy access. And then the case of rural Ghana. So I haven't talked about Ghana. I will further narrow it down to rural Ghana. And in this case, talk about electricity, cooking fuel, and some interventions to increase energy access in rural Ghana. And finally conclude, talk about the way forward and how I intend to, the methodology I intend to use in my research here in the Department of Geography, MICUL. So we know energy plays a key role in human development. We can talk of the role energy plays in education, in health, in food security, what have you. I have been in Ireland for over a year and not a single day have the lights in my apartment gone off. And I can also cook anytime I want. And I think the situation is the same for almost all of us here. So we can say access to energy is not a problem in developed countries when we talk of cooking fuels and electricity. However, the problem has to do with the traditional sources linked to energy. We know energy is is the second most contributor to greenhouse gas. So the problem is, how do we shift from energy being a big contributor to greenhouse gas to a clean energy system? So when you go to countries like Ireland and Germany, we find renewable energy being the order of the day. I remember how excited I was when I arrived in Ireland and I saw wind turbines for the first time. It was a very remarkable experience. So most countries in the EU have electricity access rates of about 100%. And so it's not surprising that we see a lot of developed countries channeling all efforts and resources into renewable energy. As I said earlier on, when we talk of energy access, it is not a problem in the developed world. But when we talk of the developing world, energy access is a major problem because 1 in every 10 people globally has no access to electricity. And majority of these people are in the developing world. Also, it is said that a third of the world's population are without access to clean cooking fuels and more efficient technologies. And majority of these people find themselves in the developing world. And when we talk of the developing world, of course, we cannot leave sub-Saharan Africa out of it. So many of the people without access to electricity and clean cooking fuels are found in sub-Saharan Africa. So now let me narrow things down to Ghana. So let's talk about the case of Ghana. Ghana boasts of an 83% electricity access. I think some of us will say 83% is not something to boast of. However, in the African context, this is a very remarkable achievement. So the main source of electricity is hydro. So hydro is the main source of electricity. So in Ghana, we have the Akosombo Dam, the Pond Dam, the Bui Dam, all generating electricity for the country. And also, there is the liquefied petroleum gas, which is used by some Ghanaian residents. However, there is the access to these energy sources is urban biased, meaning when you go to Ghana, you find people and the usage of electricity and liquefied petroleum gas being used only in urban communities. Let's look at some of the disparities in the urban and rural communities. Talk of electricity. Access rates in rural Ghana stands at 67.2%, which is very low compared to urban Ghana, which stands at 100%. So in order to meet their electricity demands, you find a lot of rural dwellers resorting to the use of kerosene lamps, candles, and battery-powered LEDs. And we know these electricity sources are not clean for the environment. Now let's talk about cooking fuel. Wood fuels are the dominant sources of cooking fuel in the country, and it is predominantly used by rural dwellers. And wood fuels come in forms such as firewood and charcoal. And an interesting thing about wood fuels is that you find the livelihoods of so many rural dwellers tied to the production and sale of charcoal, which is an unclean fuel. So to this end, we get to know that the energy sources used by residents in rural Ghana are highly or heavily linked to greenhouse gas emissions. Talk of kerosene lamps, candles, battery-powered LEDs, and wood fuels. Following this, it's a big challenge towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 2, Goal 3, Goal 13, and particularly the Sustainable Development Goal 7. As a result, there are a lot of interventions that have been put in place in Ghana to ensure that rural dwellers have access to clean energy. And one of such intervention is the Rural Electrification Project, which started in 1990. And this intervention purposely is to extend the national grid to cover the national electricity grid to cover rural communities. And another intervention is the Rural LPG program, which also started in 2013. And the purpose was also to extend the use of liquefied petroleum gas to rural communities. And finally, the inclusive innovations interventions. And this intervention is very common currently in the country. And it comes in the form of uh, pro-poor innovations. And as you see on the screen, examples of these inclusive innovations are clean cook stoves. We see a woman using it. We have mini grids, we have solar home systems, and we also have photovoltaic lanterns. And since they are pro-poor innovations, they are intended to address the energy needs of those excluded, thus the poor in rural communities. And distribution of these innovations have been championed by stakeholders in the energy sector. We can talk about the Ministry of Energy in the country is championing the distribution. Civil society organizations are also doing their part, non-governmental organizations, and we have private entities like Zola Electric and PEG Africa, all championing the distribution of such inclusive innovations. But the problem is these innovations do not reach the intended beneficiaries. And even if they do, they are unable to meet their energy demands. So when you go to rural communities, despite the inclusive innovations interventions being deployed, you realize that a lot of people still cling to the use of the unclean fuels that I made mention of earlier on. Now let's look at, I decided to make this slide talk about rural Ghana in pictures in this slide. So in this slide, you see a woman charging her solar home systems panel. So imagine if you are in a household of, let's say, 5 people, and this is your only source of electricity. Is this going to be enough for the house? I remember there was a day I was in a rural community, and I was gathering data, and I asked them whether they had access to electricity. They said yes. So I decided to stay there longer. So when it was around 7 p.m., they turned on the lights, and this was the situation. I couldn't even write using the lights. I had to use my phone to support me in writing. And so most of the inclusive innovations interventions are unable to meet the electricity or energy needs of the rural poor. And another, in this picture, you see students still using candles and kerosene lamps in their studies. And in the next picture, still people in rural communities resort to the use of firewood and charcoal in as a source of cooking fuel. So what are the effects of the usage of these unclean fuels? One, is the greenhouse gas emissions. So emissions still continue, and this is also resulting in health problems, especially for women and children. We know women are the people who spend a lot of time in the kitchen, and so they are exposed to the health hazards associated with the use of unclean cooking fuels, and also poor quality of services. Because of this, when you go to rural Ghana, people are not having access to good health care, good education, what have you. So what's the way forward? The way forward is to expand debates on energy transition in the global south, particularly in rural communities. And this is exactly what I'm doing through my PhD study. And in my study, I'm looking at a broad political ecology approach to low carbon technology in rural Ghana. And through this study, I aim to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal 7, which in part seeks to ensure affordable and clean energy for all. And in my study, as the topic suggests, I am going to focus on Ghana. And in Ghana, I am going to use 5 rural communities as a case study. And the selection of these communities will be done in consultation with key stakeholders such as the Ministry of Energy, private energy providers, and others. The research methods I intend to employ or use mixed method approach. The qualitative and quantitative approaches are going to be used. And this is to help ensure complementarity, where I can be able to compare findings from one approach to the other. And also it will ensure initiation, and I can be able to identify some contradiction and also go back to the field if need be. And with the scope of the study, data collected will of course relate to the context of Ghana only. And energy in this work will only relate to that's used for cooking and lighting. That's the working definition of energy would be once used for cooking and lighting only. And in collecting data, primary and secondary data will be used in the study. And primary data will be sourced from community and institutional level interviews. And with community surveys, I'm going to use questionnaires and focus group discussion guides. And with the institutional surveys, structured interviews are going to be used. And for secondary data, I'm going to source secondary data from articles, reports, and policy documents. And the sampling method I intend to use it with regards to institutions. When conducting institutional interviews, I intend to involve only 15 people. That's 15 key informants will be purposely selected from institutions to be involved in the study. And with the focus group discussions, I am going to have 5 of them. That's one focus group discussion will be held in each community. And in each focus group discussion, a minimum of 15 people will be involved. And in getting the sample size for the study, I intend to use a formula by Miller and Brewer in 2003. And this formula has been used in a lot of social science research. And that's the population of all the 5 communities over the population of the 5 communities plus 1, multiplying a margin of error of 0.05 raised to the power 2. And using this formula, I'll be able to arrive at the sample size for the study. And because I want to get a representative sample from each community, I don't want the situation where, let's say, I arrive at a sample size of 100. And because I'm working in 5 communities, I just choose 20 from each community. I don't want I don't want to be in that situation. So I want to get a representative number from each community. And in doing so, I plan to use a formula that's the population of a particular place all over the entire population of the 5 communities, multiplying the sample size that I will get using the initial formula, the one by Miller and Brewer. So with this formula, I'll be able to get a representative sample from each community based on the community's population size. And before each individual is allowed to take part in the research, he or she will be allowed to read a participant information form detailing what the research is about. And after that, we'll be asked to sign a consent form. And in my data analysis, I intend to analyze the quantitative data with the use of Statistical Package for Social Sciences, the SPSS version 20, And the qualitative data, I'll be using the in vivo software in analyzing the qualitative data. And data will be organized and presented with the help of Microsoft Excel. And it will be done in the form of tables, figures, charts, and percentages. Now, what are some key takeaways from the presentation I just made? Now, we know that access to energy is problematic in sub-Saharan Africa, and an example is Ghana. And there is disparity in energy access among rural and urban dwellers, with rural communities at the losing end. And as from the presentation, we get to know that indeed this is true, and this is something happening in almost all sub-Saharan African countries. Another is that clean energy interventions are not yielding the intended results, as vulnerable people do not get access, or even if they do, they are unable to meet their energy demands. And finally, stakeholders must commit to ensuring that rural dwellers are carried along in the just transition process. That we should make sure that the vulnerable or the poor, they are not left behind in the transition process. To end, this is where I end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dickson. That was really informative. And I think you hit the 20 minutes absolutely perfectly on cue. So that's a fantastic achievement. Well done. What I might do is, before we move on to Josephine, if there's any burning questions, any clarifications that anybody wants to make or to ask Dickson, I think we could give it a couple of minutes. Absolutely. I saw one question, Arnott or Julie. Yeah.
Julie, Arnott, Julie, whichever.
Julie,
I have a question with the questioner. How are you going to identify the people that you're going to include? Because your sample size is going to be quite small. And how are you going to find people that are representative of the community?
Okay. First and foremost, I intend to I'm not going to involve children, so children are not going to be, will not be involved in the study. Because the problem is spread across, I don't know, it's general, so I'm going to use a simple random sampling method. So once you fall within the age brackets, you can't be interviewed. So I'll use a simple random.
Are you going to 5 different regions, is it?
5 different communities, yeah. Or
communities.
Regions, yeah.
Okay, and how are you choosing them?
Okay, so as I said in the presentation, the selection of the communities is being done in consultation with the Ministry of Energy in Ghana. So I contacted them and they sent me a list of all communities where low carbon interventions are being deployed. So I'll select one community where mini grids are being deployed, one where clean cook stoves are being deployed, one where PV lanterns are being deployed, one where solar home systems are being deployed, and finally choose one where none of the interventions are being deployed. So I'll know whether what their expectations from the low carbon transition, whether they are expectant to transforming into a low carbon transition system, or they are just okay with how things are.
Okay, so that's how you're going to decide on the regions, but how are you going to decide on who to interview within those regions then? Because it's kind of got multi-stages, isn't it?
Okay, so after identifying the communities, so let's say I go into community 1. I'll find out the number of people. So let's say community with mini grids. I'll find out the number of people who are being supplied with electricity via the mini grids. And once I get the number, I'll use a simple random sampling in interviewing them. Is it clear enough?
Yeah, no, I did I did random sampling in Uganda, and I was doing some field work, and it was really interesting because we worked with village health leaders, and then one of the communities that we selected was more interested in like natural medicine, so it was very like against Western medicine, and then we had to go back and do some more randomized sampling. So it's just the things that come up in the field. I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and thanks for that, Julie and Dickson. DK, I'm not sure, do I have your name correct, but your hand is raised, so feel free to ask.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to ask regarding the clean fuels that is being proposed in the form of LPG. For example, in India, the PM Ujjwala scheme was able to provide, around more than 1 crore connections. But then over a period of time, the study found that more than 90 lakh people were not able to buy the second cylinder, the second LPG cylinder, because of the cost. So how impactful do you think introduction of an alien cooking system like LPG is going to have on the rural people, especially when they are using locally sourced fuel sources like firewood or something? So how are we going to counter that?
Okay, so not to give out my finding.
Ask, yeah.
Okay, that's a very interesting. Not to give out my finding. It's actually one thing that I intend to find out from my research. But from the literature, what I'm reading, I think what you said applies in Ghana. So cost is a problem. Usually these interventions are sent to rural communities, and they find the cost to be so expensive, and so they do not buy them. And it's one of the things that I intend to find out from my study, whether the rural poor are benefiting from such interventions, what's preventing them from gaining access or using these interventions. But from the literature I reviewed, I think cost is one of the major problems that's preventing them from accessing the interventions.
Yeah. So some studies based in India have also found that LPG becomes an additional cooking source rather than a replacement. Yeah. So just wanted to add.
Thank you so much.
I think this is really interesting in looking at some of the global applications of research across different contexts, and I think it's enormously important, and it's a real value in forums like this. So thanks very much, Dickie. Thanks, Dickson. If it's okay, what I might do, I don't see any more hands, but there will be an opportunity at the end again, but I might move on to Josephine, if that's okay. So I'm just going to, Dickson, would it be possible to stop sharing your screen just to make sure that Josephine, no, you're okay. So just to make sure Josephine will be in a position to share hers. So Josephine Tracy is a lecturer here in TUS in the Department of Applied Social Sciences, based in Limerick. And I think Thurles as well, Josephine, if I'm correct. I think you do some work in Thurles.
I did. Yeah, Thurles usually.
Absolutely. So you would have worked previously in the environmental department in Cork County Council and have a particular interest in looking at academic writing and water management. So I'll hand over to you, Josephine. Fire away. That's fine.
There, is it?
Absolutely, it's perfect.
Is it perfect?
Yeah.
So thanks, Paul, for the introduction. So the title of my presentation, I'm looking at water and climate change and academic writing. And the reason I have the C, a small c, is because we have to have climate, whereas the change part is what we're challenged by. So my presentation is going to focus on, the interlinks between water and climate change. The theme related to the theme of the summer school, can academic writing be used to develop critical perspective around the Sustainable Development Goals? And then with some of my writing, I'm going to link up with water services and security and the Sustainable Development Goals. So before I start the presentation, if you have an opportunity, if you're on your phone, if you're on your computers, and if you have your phones beside you, if you wish, if you Google Sustainable Development Goals and click on images and just load down the Sustainable Development Goals so you'd have them in front of you. And when you look at the goals here, it's obviously there's a lot of them related to water and climate from the titles. But I want you to reflect during when I'm going through the slides, is there any others that are related to Sustainable Development Goals? So when we talk about water, I suppose it's interconnected between groundwater, surface waters, and in Ireland we have some beautiful aquifers. And also it's connected with, you know, the atmosphere, the lithosphere, which is our soil systems, our biosphere, which is our flora and fauna. And we as humans, we're part of the living species. Your hydrosphere, which is our surface waters, our cryosphere, which is the solid water on the earth. It could be related to our glaciers, our permafrost. And another interesting one is the ionosphere, which is humans again, because humans are very much involved in the water cycle. And we are a high thinking species, so we have control in terms of how we manage our water systems. And if the climate goes out, you know, if the climate changes and the temperature changes, even a very small change in the physical forms of water, when we're talking about solid, liquid and gas, can have a big impact on our climates, our biodiversity, our well-being and our weather. So an interesting point that the United Nations Water Policy Brief on Climate Change in 219 have stated that when we talk about the global climate crisis, we have to link it very much with water and the impacts it has, you know, on our habitats and our biodiversity and ourselves as humans and the potential resources that water give us in terms of water services. So this is just an interesting map of the world that we all know where the countries are. And it, you know, in terms of climate change, the big indicator is carbon dioxide emission. And unfortunately, the developed countries give the most emission of carbon, but the underdeveloped countries suffer most from the stresses of the temperature rises, such as in terms of water, the biggest problems are droughts and flooding events, which is very major. So when you're looking at that, you can just kind of think of that question there. So when you're, I suppose, when you're talking about water management and engaging in climate change, you have to look at policy and engagement and implementation of the policy and the engagement. So what I have here is traditionally the macrosphere was the governance in terms of where policy is introduced. And the microsphere is your policy enacted. So in the diagram here, usually the macrosphere is on the outside and the microsphere is on the inside, but I have it the other way around here. So it's very important for the people on the ground, the enacted policy, to be overlapping with the governance. And I suppose it's beginning to move in that direction in terms of, instead of the top-down approach, the bottom-up approach. So when we talk about water and climate, it's important to look at that variable. So in terms of linking academic writing in terms of a critical perspective around water and climate, linking with the Sustainable Development Goals, when you're doing academic writing, these are 6 pointers that you should use. But in terms of pointer 6, it's very important to innovate and critically evaluate in terms of academic writing. So when you're academic writing and you're taking secondary data and you want people to use it, it's very important to have very good recommendations. Even if it's secondary data, you can kind of critically evaluate for recommendations. And is there any gaps in knowledge around the secondary data? And I suppose the challenge is, can we go outside the popular culture? And even when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it is a popular culture buzz at the moment, but can you kind of look outside popular culture with even secondary data to make it relevant that people can learn from the data? And one important area, because I have written a little bit with Springer as a publisher, and they have emphasized the importance of titles. So your title can sell what you're writing, and especially in the electronic age, when we're looking at things electronically, it's very important to have a strong title to sell your article and to get people engaged with the article, and as researchers to help people find information of relevance to their research. So the academic writing titles that I have kind of been involved in: environmental hydrology and climate change. And at the start of the presentation, I kind of, did more detail around the water cycle and the proportionalities of the physical states of water and their impact on catchments. And the second one, looking at floodwater management and monitoring. And the third one that I'll talk a little bit about in terms of main pointers in it is drinking water in developing countries. So I suppose when we talk about monitoring, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And that statement came from COP24, which was back in 2018. So from that sentence, I kind of used that guide to write the article on floodwater monitoring, which could be related to other water systems. So the importance of your sample, how are you going to take your sample? And especially in a flood event, the pre-flood, during the flood, and after the flood, it's very hard to track exactly what's happening during those time periods. And also, are you going to use real-time sensors or manual sampling and monitoring? And other important areas that I was looking at in the review was, key performance indicators, because it's very expensive, especially in certain parts of the world. It's very expensive to take samples and to measure. So is there any measurement that would give us a very critical understanding of what's happening around a catchment? And Pacific and non-Pacific testing. And a very important thing in terms of flood management is early warning systems. Can we have sensors that will tell us before an event occurs that it's going to occur? And again, the importance of citizen science, because we are all walking sensors, whether we're stationary or we're walking, we're given a lot of information in terms of our bio monitoring within us, or we could have sensors with us that'll give indicators of what's happening. So the word harmonization is very important, and the word baselines. So to understand the baselines, and in environmental management, it's still very hard to understand the baseline really in terms of what we're trying to achieve by improving the baseline or making sure it stays where it is. And these are some nice international harmonization data collections, such as the Global Runoff Data Center. So there's great international cooperation in terms of understanding water and water flows and water management. And this is just from NASA. NASA, gave me a lot of data in terms of rainwater systemations over time. So I suppose the other review that I was kind of looking at was drinking water in developing countries. And I suppose it's a human right to have clean water. And there are so many people in the world that still don't have clean water. And even though they're talking about gender equality next door to us, there is a major problem, especially in third world countries. If a river was away from where people are living, the women are going to collect the water and the girls, so they're not going to school. So it's an educational problem and a gender problem. So what I was doing in the review was taking this statement again. The least number of steps in the treatment, the nearer it is to the consumer, and the less contamination in the source, it's a better water management system, especially in relation to drinking water. So the different potential sources of water could be a shallow well, a river, a spring, rainwater, and saline and brackish water. So we have an awful lot of ocean wealth around us, but you know, it is challenging getting drinking water from the oceans. So in terms of developing countries, there's a lot of problems in terms of a seasonal variation of water. So they haven't the same source of water throughout the 12 months of the year.
It's about 5 minutes now, Josephine. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of developing countries, there's a lot of contamination in the water. And when you talk about water quality, you have to link it up with wastewater management. And a big problem in developing countries, unfortunately, even though they have extreme droughts and wet season, is they have problems with arsenic in their waters. And usually what they do, you know, to minimize risks is treat for biological contamination, even though you'd like to do the chemical and the physical, but they usually do biological first. And the treatments can be centralized source treatment, which is like a centralized treatment where you'd have a large treatment plant, or the other type of treatment would be point of use treatment. So point of use treatment would be if you had a very small stream near an urban area in the developing countries, can you treat it with very cheap technology and you'd have your drinking water? So especially with the large infrastructures of treatment plants in developing countries, because of extreme weather events, they could break down. And in very rural areas, during the dry seasons, they might have very shallow waters, which is quite dirty. So there's a lot of point of use treatments where, for example, they just suck up the water and they still have clean water. It mightn't be 100% clean, but especially then drinking dirty water in terms of what they're potentially doing at the moment. So there's a lot of technologies there around that area. So the review was looking at different technologies, and other technologies would be basically collecting water, adding a sachet that would take out solids, and then adding another sachet to disinfect the water, and then filtering it through a cloth. So I suppose education around very rural areas that are very during the dry season, they have to kind of dig down and try and get some groundwater that could have a lot of sediment in it. But even these technologies will improve their lifestyles, so point of use treatment. And other areas would be just leaving water on roofs, in recycling plastic containers, and the UV light will disinfect the water. So there's a lot of research in that area. And rainwater harvesting is under-resourced in developing countries. Because during the wet season, they should really be storing their water. So in the dry seasons, they have a supply of water, but there's more education needed in that area. Desalination is a potential very good source of water, especially in developing countries during the dry seasons, but the technology is still very expensive. So there's a lot of need around that area to improve the technologies. And I suppose with climate change, the point of use treatment is very important. So if you have a massive flooding event and all the large infrastructures are damaged, that lady there could possibly even take water and use a point of use treatment, which would help her, you know, have some sort of a good water. And I suppose this is a bit of a wild card. It's just showing all the potential challenges that could be investigated. Water security, even water conservation is very important in third world countries. Even if they have scarcity of water during the dry season, they still have to be trained in conservation, and storage of water is a big problem. So they're just nice ideas there. So in terms of going back to the reflective question and the sustainable development goals, you know, we know that, you know, there are certain ones that are very much linked with water and climate from their titles. And if you look at number 13, climate action, you can see all the variables that could go under climate action alone, that it would embed a lot of sustainable development goals. So to answer the reflective question at the start, you know, there's definitely more than 5. Everything could be embedded, even peace and justice, because the future, they're debating wars about water instead of land. There could potentially be wars about water. So I suppose, and the UN Development Programme have highlighted the importance of sustainable development goal integration. So if you have a complex problem about water and the basic rights to clean water, you should engage all the sustainable development goals, and it'll have a ripple effect across the economical, social and natural ecosystems. So I'd just like to acknowledge a few people that helped me, Cross and Passion Sister, who gave me information on during the dry season in terms of the challenges of getting their water that they to borrow down to get. Even the water would be a lot of sediment in it, but the point of use treatments would be very useful. And these are just some of the articles, if you want to read further, because I've just done a summary, the articles that were written in relation to that, to the topic. So thanks for listening. So that's kind of an overview.
Thanks, Josephine. That's great.
Thanks.
There's an echo for me here for some reason. But if there's any questions, specifically around Josephine's, we might just take 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. I think rather than delay, I think it would be good, and we can deal with any questions, Josephine, if that's okay, towards the end.
Yeah,
there's a lot of food for thought there in terms of the importance of water in terms of the overall sustainable development goals.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to Frank Houghton, and Frank is a colleague. And I know you would have been interested, Frank, in that presentation as well, because you have a particular interest in publication and the power of publication in terms of both academic career advancement, but also in terms of its capacity to influence policy and practice. But Frank is a lecturer here in Applied Social Sciences and also is Director of Social Science Connections at the Technological University of the Shannon. I think Frank has a very broad range of interests in terms of both social science and geography and health, and has researched and published in epidemiology, in human geography, medical geography, therapeutic environments, inequalities in health, and a whole range of other health-related, geography-related, technically related topics. I think the specific topic that you're going to talk about with us today, Frank, relates to a project you were involved with in Nepal around leprosy. And I just noticed that you have, I think, 75 slides, but Frank is reputed.
I'm going to be very quick, I promise.
You are the, there's a DJ there, his name escapes me. But you are very a very fast presenter, I know from time. Engaged and the Dave Fanning of academic presentations.
Okay.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk about my research, and I was particularly asked to sort of try and address some of the methodological questions or methodological issues that maybe new researchers. We've had some great presentations today from people who are very experienced in what you might call international research, and particularly in terms of what you might call the global south. I would describe myself as very inexperienced. So I'm going to share some of my learning. And as it's called here today, a steep learning curve, exploring leprosy in Nepal. I should just give a quick shout out to those that funded this research. It was funded under the Irish Research Council's New Foundations Programme. So I just want to mention that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about background about leprosy and my work in Nepal, the study, but really focusing more on what you might call sort of learning and reflection and sharing that. So like lots of pieces of research, some of the best pieces of research and most interesting I've ever got involved with, it started over a cup of coffee. I know Mike Winterburn is probably one of in the audience here. Mike invited me for a chat. We had a chat, and he discussed some of the work that he'd been doing in Nepal Leprosy Trust. And I thought it sounded really, really interesting. I was born in Singapore. I've worked in New Zealand. I've worked in the States. I've obviously worked in the UK and Ireland. But I really hadn't done anything what you might call the global south. And from a public health perspective, that always seemed like a big gap that I was quite conscious of. So, what Mike explained to me, horrified me, to be honest, around leprosy. I don't know if you're aware, but in the year 2000, the World Health Organization, in its infinite wisdom, decided to declare leprosy eliminated. Now, as you can imagine, that obviously had a knock-on impact. The trouble was, it wasn't actually eliminated in the sense that you, I, and probably every epidemiologist in the world would understand the term eliminated. What they actually meant was kind of, controlled. It was below a certain rate per X many thousand of the population. But what happened then, of course, is that, countries could declare themselves leprosy free, funding dried up, not-for-profits moved out. And of course, you then end up in a situation where, which country actually wants to go looking at their leprosy levels? Who wants to do sort of the gold standard of active case finding in order to properly evaluate the real prevalence of leprosy in their population? And it was interesting. Before I went out to Nepal, I happened to go down to my local pharmacist, and I was talking to him about jabs and things like that. And he gave a response which I think is quite typical, probably in Ireland. I haven't heard about that since Bible class. As far as most of us are concerned, leprosy is something which disappeared long ago. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Now, one thing I do want to sort of stress to new researchers is when they start investigating a project, don't be overwhelmed by the volume of information and the volume of information that you didn't know. So let me give an example. I like to research, and as Paul mentioned, I tend to research across a variety of areas because I just enjoy learning. I enjoy encountering new information. So whenever I get an idea for a project, I'm kind of there. I don't know how many of you have come across this before. This is the Dunning-Kruger curve. And I love it because you have an idea for a project, but unbeknownst to yourself, you're kind of at the peak of Mount Stupid. You think you know a bit about a topic, but in reality, you don't. As you start to read up on it, you basically find yourself quickly going down into the valley of despair. Now, the thing to say is that don't lose heart at this point. Don't be overwhelmed. Stick with it. Keep reading. Talk about it. Read more. And you slowly start to move up through the slope of enlightenment. Okay, into what's called the plateau of sustainability. So I approached leprosy thinking I knew a bit. Of course, like every other project I've ever got involved in, it soon became clear that it was more complex than I thought. But initially, working with Mike, we wrote, I think it was 3 different things, basically where we tried to highlight, lads, there's something wrong here. The WHO has brought in this definition of elimination. It's wholly inappropriate. And it was really, to help NLT, Nepal Leprosy Trust, possibly to obtain funding. And lo and behold, although I had initially approached this purely thinking it might help them, achieve funding, this new foundation's opportunity came up, and with Mike's encouragement, I decided to go for it. Honest truth, not expecting to get it. So what ended up happening? Well, I got funding to travel to Nepal, and we'll just run through a couple of slides just in case some people's geography is not so good. On this map, I was particularly down there at the bottom in the sort of pinky area in Province 2. So this is Nepal. And if you take a look, I mean, most of us tend to think about the very mountainous regions, but where I was actually sort of much lower down in this area. So that's the image you have in Nepal. Well, where I went was nothing like that. Right down near I suppose the nearest large city would be Janakpur. So very, very close to the Indian border. So that's where I ended up traveling. Now, to put it into an SDG context, yeah, I'm kind of looking at health, absolutely. So, that's obviously SDG Goal 3, and neglected tropical diseases come in under that. But it's impossible to talk about leprosy without thinking about these other SDGs as well, because you've got stigma and exclusion. So obviously, number one, the poverty is in there. It's a particular issue with women. Women tend not to be diagnosed. They tend not to be able to travel in some countries, sort of, without oversight in order to access medications that are badly needed. So that hits number 5 there as well. People can be shunned and unable to work. So that starts to hit number 8. Number 10 is kind of really obvious, reduced inequalities. So taking a health issue, you very quickly realize how it really is, overlapping so many of these sustainable development goals. But just very quickly, looking at leprosy, you're probably aware the damage to the peripheral skin and limbs, the leg ulcers, the amputations of fingers, feet. It's very serious. One issue that possibly people aren't aware of because of the nerve damage is also the possibility of going blind. So what we're talking about here is a very, very serious disease. And as I say, the WHO declared it eliminated in 2000. And that's why I'd say it's really distressing when you visit Nepal and maybe visit the hospital there. And it's just one of, a series of hospitals. And you visit the children's ward. And obviously all of these children were born long after the year 2000, when the WHO declared it eliminated. Now, one thing which is fantastic is in recent years, leprosy is treatable. They have a combination of drugs, 3 different antibiotics, multi-drug therapy, that actually makes this treatable. That obviously raises the issue. So why is treatment of leprosy still an issue? And that was really one of the things that I was hoping to get at. One of the reasons is that routine treatment can be 6 months, 12 months, or longer. 2 years is not necessarily uncommon. As well as that, the treatment is extremely, the medication is really quite harsh. People can have significant side effects requiring hospitalization. It can even turn patches of your skin dark, and that can take a couple of years potentially to clear, and that's an issue in terms of stigma. I'll be obviously returning to stigma in a little while, but other issues around treatment, illiteracy and education are crucial issues. People need to understand the regime and understand that just because the symptoms start to disappear, the problem hasn't necessarily gone away. That's vital. And obviously poverty. It's all very well for me, and I'm very conscious of it. I work in Technological University of the Shannon. If I get sick, I literally just stop and go to work. They continue to pay me, even for extended periods. That's obviously very different if you're working a sort of subsistence farmer, maybe possibly being paid basically per day with food, which is how some of the most excluded populations work in Nepal. You then obviously have distance and transport issues, both in terms of initial diagnosis, but then in terms of subsequent access to medications. And again, when you combine distance and transport issues with some poor road networks and poverty, all of this becomes hugely problematic. I've already mentioned this to some extent, but time away from work. Another factor which can affect treatment rates is reality that there tends to be a lot of relocation for work. For sort of young men from Nepal in particular, it's often been going to the Middle East to gain employment, sometimes or regularly, I'm told, in terms of night watchman, night security kind of details. So obviously, if you leave the country, you very probably don't want to tell your new employer that you've actually been on leprosy treatment. You're no longer able to access your leprosy medications. So again, that becomes something of an issue. Other issues include alternative belief systems and different, sort of ways of approaching healing, rather than, simply adopting our sort of Western biomedical model, which we're all so familiar with. So why in particular is non-adherence an issue then? Well, one is obviously because leprosy untreated can often result in very serious physical conditions, including lower limb amputations. I mentioned blindness earlier. There's also the reality that you can, at a very low rate, most people, it appears, are sort of naturally immune from leprosy. We've been around leprosy for a long time, they think, so most people have a natural resistance, but you do tend to still see almost like clusters in areas. So there is the ongoing issue of contagion. And obviously, a major issue is around stigma, okay, and the exclusion. And NLT has been doing some fantastic work, not the work that I'm involved in, but I will mention it briefly, but work that I really thought was extremely impressive. So even though it's not my research, I'm going to mention it today briefly and point people where they can go to learn a bit more about it. There's also the ongoing issue of, we're all familiar with antimicrobial resistance, which some of us probably know better as sort of antibiotic resistance. People may have heard about antibiotic resistant TB and some STDs. Well, one really quite concerning problem because of the growth of antimicrobial resistance, which basically means that our drugs cease to work, is the beginnings of observations of resistant leprosy strains, and that is a huge issue, and one that obviously, if we could sort of cure leprosy in the general population, which will require active case finding, massive active case finding, then we can potentially eliminate this problem. But while it continues to sort of sneak under the radar and nobody wants to go looking, and and I think the WHO hold a high degree of responsibility here. It's likely to continue, and the growth of antimicrobial resistant leprosy strains, I think, can only increase. So my project was really to go and try and look at the epidemiology of non-adherence. So I've kind of outlined leprosy and outlined, some of the side effects and why it's important that people do take their medications. I was particularly interested in that. I was also interested in the impact of lockdown. So I've mentioned transport, and this was, the impact of COVID is what I'm really talking about here. So what was the impact of COVID on people, initial diagnosis, on accessing their medications, just how much did COVID interfere with this? And I suppose I hate to seem pessimistic, but one of the reasons that I was particularly interested in this is kind of, okay, if I can explore what the impact of COVID was on current multi-drug therapy treatment for leprosy, what does that mean for the next pandemic? And I say that's why I don't mean to be pessimistic. But, you know, in recent years, we've had Ebola, we've had SARS, avian influenza, swine flu, cholera, dengue, MERS-CoV, Zika. We've all heard, I'm sure, about monkeypox in the last couple of days, which doesn't seem to be in the same league at all. But, you know, the next pandemic is a given. Can we try and set up systems so that medication can continue to, well, diagnosis and medication can be sustained for the next pandemic? So I ended up traveling to Nepal. As you can, this was sort of the latter half of last year. There was, you know, a bans on travel, which sort of suddenly ceased, and then obviously needing to access PCR tests. So just from a logistical perspective, it proved to be extremely interesting. And I know one of the colleagues from UL actually had trouble getting back from Nepal because she tested positive. Then again, Kathmandu is not the worst place in the world to, you know, have to stay a few extra nights, but nonetheless, logistically problematic. So this is where I ended up visiting. It's Lalgad Leprosy Hospital and Services Centre. And I'll just give you a few pictures. That's picturesque. Actually, my understanding, Mike was involved in actually sort of carving some of this out of the brush or jungle, as it was right at the beginning of the venture here. But what I'm going to talk about today, because that was a focus I was asked to give, is not so much my project in any more depth or the results, but a little bit of reflection on my research. And I suppose one thing that struck me, my background is very much public health geography, and colleagues asked me, you know, they sort of mentioned in advance, you know, how friends had been, you know, transformed by visiting Nepal. So I went, I suppose, expecting some sort of Damascene conversion en route. But I suppose what I found from my perspective was very much, you know, kind of effectively the same problems in a different place. This was, to me, classic public health. So we have exclusion and poverty and illness in Ireland. There's exclusion, poverty and illness in all countries, including Nepal. Now, my wife, as I say, would possibly suggest that's because I have the emotional range of a teaspoon. But to me, it was just more public health. It was same old sort of issues, albeit in a different place. And I think that's one of the takeaways for me about public health. You know, it is global. We see the same problems across the world. Another thing, I suppose, just to emphasize to people who are involved in research, you know, in other organizations, but particularly when traveling internationally, you know, information systems, I'm glad I know this from my public health background, information systems never really deliver what you anticipate they deliver. No matter how they were built, you can have the best built information system in the world. Odds on people aren't populating the information in that database, or it's not being accurately populated, or the information isn't being quality checked. So my initial hopes at sort of the first run of my research, basically the information systems weren't kind of what I was hoping for, but I'm pleased to say I wasn't necessarily expecting. Now, in a standard year, I would often have up to 24 undergrad dissertations to supervise, up to 3 TORAs, anything up to 3 masters or PhD students. But when it came to research in Nepal, I really was an absolute beginner, and I'd be the first to admit that I very quickly found myself down there in the valley of despair, thinking, "Oh Lord, how do I you know, try and navigate a way to achieve the research?" One really interesting meeting, and you know, this is classic kind of someone from outside suddenly arrives to do a piece of research. I had one meeting where, you know, the person that I'm in the room with said, "Oh, I've looked at that before," and I'm like, "Oh God, what?" So I see that, Paul. Thank you. So basically, I very quickly began to feel I know nothing, absolutely nothing. Just again, in terms of working in other countries, you know, you need to think simple things like hearing, masks, accent, terminology, language differences. There was to some extent a gulf of mutual incomprehension, with lots of information being lost in translation. I, in my naivety, had assumed, you know, that Nepali would be the issue, completely forgetting that regional languages are perfectly, are much more common. On my second trip, I almost managed to land on one of their major holidays. So again, something you don't necessarily think about in advance. I know one of my colleagues arrived at harvesting season. Again, not something we necessarily think about here when traveling abroad. So something to think about. But I'm pleased to say, and sticking with it on reflection, the computer says maybe this time. So the project began to work. Really important to think about ethics, not just ethics approval from Ireland, but ethics approval from abroad. And again, the last thing we want to do is to have some sort of data raid. So, I would strongly advocate basically a Nepalese model, which is a co-investigator model of working with local folks. You also need to be very aware of cultural norms and operating in a different religious environment. I found it quite strange that people assumed I was a missionary, a Christian missionary. I'm always considered myself kind of evangelical atheist, so that was interesting for me. I did kind of wonder, initially, why they'd fly a white guy like me 8,000 kilometers to do this. But I feel very much it's about building links. And I won't go into detail here, but we've already, started possible ideas about future projects. I don't really have time for that. Come back to this. So just to finish, for me, it was an enormous learning curve. The original idea that I had was of dubious relevance. Plans drawn up from a distance really were of little use. Multiple meetings, I know this was mentioned this morning, multiple meetings were required, and it is about time and building up those relationships. Language skills are crucial, and I think one model that I often see is chain research. You do a small piece of research. If you're comfortable working with the partners and they're comfortable working with you, you try another piece of research. I did love the co-investigator model, and I do think there could be the beginnings of a good working relationship with both the Lalgad hospital, but also locally with colleagues in UL. And I think there's potentially valuable linkages for TUS with Nepal. So I just like lastly to thank again, obviously my funders, but also Mike Winterburn from TUS, NLT Ireland, the Grow office here at LIT or TUS, and the staff there. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I know we're probably taking these en masse now. Thank you.
No, Frank, that's great. Well done. Excellent. I might just, before we do look at a more general way, is there any particular responses or any clarifications that Mike do? Is there anything you'd like to add or to input in terms of Frank's talk? Dickson, sorry, you had a question as well?
Yeah, Frank, thank you for the presentation. I think this is for personal reasons. I would like to know at what stage does leprosy become contagious?
Oh,
Is it
yeah,
at
that
the
is
initial stage? Or? Yeah,
I'll be honest with you, I'm not a physician and I don't know that. What I do understand, and I don't know if Mike can, if I'm wrong here, it does require prolonged exposure, is my understanding. It's not something, visiting, Nepal, visiting a person, shaking hands with them. None of this, is my understanding, is actually going to transmit leprosy. It really is. It's interesting. Leprosy was the first. Leprosy is kind of known in the world of sort of biomedical research. It was the first bacteria that they actually identified, that they actually were able to figure out what it did. Way back in like the 1800s. But bizarrely enough, we don't actually know that much about leprosy since. It's almost as though they kind of looked at that and then went looking at other stuff. So it's funny, we don't have as much knowledge about it as perhaps we should, given that it was the very first bacteria that resulted in a disease that we ever as humans identified.
Good, thank you.
Michael, you might have something to add.
Yeah, I just want to say two things that are not that related. Thanks, Frank. I really enjoyed that. So it's very hard to catch leprosy. it's only really in Nepal, at least, it's referred to as a poor man's disease. So health and clean water, sanitation issues, poor nutrition, and you need to be exposed to the bacteria for a long period of time, for years, before you're likely to catch it. But anyway, if you do catch it, if you're working in that environment, you just take antibiotics. Just want to throw out a thought here. Okay, I was recently at the DOCUS AGM. So DOCUS is the umbrella organisations for INGOs in Ireland, and arising from the Sustainable Development Goals, the theme of their conference was on locally led development. So there's a shifting paradigm in development work, that the locals, if you like, global south, whatever term you want to refer to, they should be leading the whole development process. So I want to throw out a parallel question. Should we be looking at locally led research?
I think, Michael, that's the first question we'll throw up open to the floor. But before we do, Michael, if it's okay, Julie, you had something maybe quick you wanted to refer to Frank, but I think Michael's question needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah. What also Frank said that he was using the co-investigator model, so I presume that was with a local partner. I was going to ask you about antimicrobial resistance. Obviously, if somebody has access to antibiotics, it's not just as simple as you get leprosy and you take the antibiotics. As you said, it could take treatment for, was it up to 2 years?
Well, I think 2 years would be exceptional, but 6 months or 1 year would be fairly standard. It's serious medication.
And that requires uninterrupted access, with, I presume in rural areas, it's hard to access the medication in the first place, regardless. And also you can see how antimicrobial resistance happens that way, because even in Ireland, like 1 week of antibiotics, there's non-adherence as well. So you can see how that's occurring. I was wondering if you could share the links you had to, was it the elimination article? You had a list of the articles and you just flick past them. So I was just wondering if you could share them.
Yeah. No, I will.
Whenever.
Yeah, I will, certainly.
We'll get that up on the site, Julie, and we'll have it shared to all participants. That's great. I think, thank you, Julie. That's excellent. Could we return to Michael's question? I think this idea of locally led research, and especially in the context of, I suppose, a symposium here that's looking at primarily at academic. How does that play out? Is that happening? Is that likely to become something we as academics are going to have to become more engaged with? So, I mean, I'm going to open it to the floor, but I might like, Kieran, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot again, but I mean, might you be in a position just to respond to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I suppose obviously, well, I mean, sorry, most of you won't know, but all my experiences in Ireland, I have no experience outside of Ireland, so it's very much, I suppose, at a community level in Ireland is what my experience would be. I think one of the questions that always arises for me in this, and I actually was reading something there recently on the whole question of what exactly do we mean by that? What does community-led actually mean? Because they're all very loaded and certainly very debatable terms in their own right, and there are all different forms of, I suppose, leadership and control of the process and control of how things happen. So the first point, I suppose, I would be more talking about community-led rather than necessarily locally led. I suppose locally led could have a local research, an academic researcher as the lead researcher in it. From the community perspective, I suppose where I have come to in all of this myself is I've kind of divided the process into three, and it's not so much research. I suppose at the very best is action research, because it's more instrumentalist really, and it is. I have this view now of participation expert input and then consultation. This kind of a model, and as you know, Paul, we worked for many years on very highly participative, very much community-led in many ways projects in terms of community planning. There's a challenge there in terms of capacity and just the skill set of people and the length of time it takes them to develop those skill sets if they're going to be really involved. However, at the very initial part of it, where I think the critical part and the critical participatory element of it comes in, is in setting the goals, in setting the purpose, and in maybe setting the approaches and the ideas and the methodologies that might be used in collaboration with the expertise at that point. But that's the participative place at which I would say the views of the local community, the community-led element becomes strongest, because it is their, I suppose, outcomes that really need to be the focus at that point. I think the expertise comes in the second phase, where it's more difficult for people to have the knowledge and the skill sets and so on in order to do the second phase. In the case of the work I would have been involved in, it is really about how do you move from the vision to the actual outcome? How do you make that happen? The practicalities of that. But the final part of it then is back to the consultation part, which says, this is where we've agreed we want to go. Here is what the expert knowledge suggests is the way we should do it. What do you think of that? Does that work for you, or do we need to go back and revisit the start again? So I suppose that's just in my kind of context, which I know is different from what you're talking about, really. But that would be kind of my experience, I suppose.
Thanks, Kieran. Is there anybody else? I'll come back to you, Michael, in a second, if that's okay. But is there anybody else would like to say anything about their experience or their perspectives on locally led, community-led research? While somebody else is gathering your thoughts, which I hope somebody will, I mean, I might just add that, I mean, I think this is a really opportune year. It's 100 years since Paulo Freire was born. And I mean, I think Paulo Freire, as a proponent of politically grounded local participatory research and mobilization, I think it's a really good opportunity to revisit his work as a practitioner from the Global South who has had a huge impact on, I suppose, both community development, but also, I suppose, in critical education. And I think that, so from my perspective, I think the three contexts that we've been speaking about, whether it's health, whether it's energy, whether it's poverty, or whether it's, water, poverty is the issue in many cases, and it's the poorest people who are the most severely affected. I think that's really important to put at the centre of this, as well as it is in the Sustainable Development Goals. Michael, did you have something you wanted maybe to add in terms of where you see this going?
Yeah, I could say a couple of things. Now I've got two hats, okay? I've got an academic hat and I've got a development hat. So I kind of speak both sides. I think actually what Frank was saying in his talk is that the same issues in Nepal are everywhere else. And I think all that Kieran said is very true. You know, issues that occur in Ireland, you know, in developing research or whatever, the same as in Nepal. But anyway, the leprosy hospital that Frank referred to. So we've encouraged the local staff to take on small little research projects themselves. So I think Frank kind of interacted a little bit with some staff members there. But that obviously depends on capacity and capacity building. If you're in a very rural community where people are illiterate, you're not going to be writing academic papers. But I think it's the power balance, isn't it? You know, I think we can't parachute in somewhere, do the research and exit. You know, yeah. So I think, of course, we need to encourage locally led research as well as development. That'd be my view.
Just like to come back in there again briefly, Paul. I mean, one of the critical things in this is actually deciding what is the question that is going to be researched and what are the issues that are going to be addressed. And I think that's where the danger is, that in the past, two things have happened. First of all, I suppose, at least again, talking now from my experience, it was external people who decided what we were going to look at. It was external people who decided what the problems were.
Yeah.
And I had one salutary experience where we were engaging with the travelling community, and wanting to engage with them ethically, we actually said, look, here are the boundaries within which we're asking you questions, because we know whatever the response, they won't go outside these boundaries. And the response was from the members of the travelling community, we don't like those boundaries. And that was a brilliant answer. I absolutely loved it, because that was actually the real point, was the boundaries were wrong, but we had no control over them. But it really was a salutary lesson.
Thanks, Kieran. Julie, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I'd just be careful on our use of language. Somebody just said illiterate people can't contribute to academic papers. I found that quite rude.
Sorry, I mean write academic papers. No, we would
I
have people contributing, but not writing.
I know, but you could have focus group discussions and you can facilitate that, whereby illiterate people can be empowered
Absolutely,
to contribute to academic writing. So,
Of course.
thank you.
Could I just sort of, on that point, Julie, I think, and tying it with Kieran and Michael, I mean, I worked with travellers recently in the last number of years, and I remember at a workshop talking to them, and in my naivety, telling them that knowledge is power. They were asking why they were doing this research methods, and they said no, in their experience, knowledge is theft. Because so many people had come in and researched them over the years and come back with nothing, and nothing had changed. And I think that's really, I suppose, speaking to your point and Michael's point and your point, Kieran, in terms of where we stand as academics in relation to those that are most vulnerable. Dickson, you had a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I wanted to share something, a lesson I learned whilst working with an NGO in Ghana. I realized involving community members is very key, especially in problem identification and in planning of a strategy to use. So in one of the projects that we were doing, we sat in our office and then we identified a problem for the rural communities, thinking they needed a toilet facility. So we were able to gather funds and then we constructed a toilet for them in the rural community. And no one was using it. And I think the mistake we made was we didn't identify the problem that's really affected them from the grassroots. So involving the community in the problem identification and in planning of the strategy is very important in everything that we do, be it research or development practice.
Thanks, Dickson. What I might do, if it's okay, I mean, just relate another two stories that resonated with me as we were as our speakers were giving their presentations. One is in relation to yours, Josephine. I worked in Ethiopia on village water supplies, and my target had been 15 village water supplies in the year, and after a year I only had 5. And I wrote to my father, who was an engineer, telling him how disappointed I was, and the difficulty was getting local people mobilized, and women in particular involved in the committees, because the committees had to be led by women, and it was taking much longer than I thought as an engineer. And he didn't write back to me, but he sent me a photograph of the Balalubi village water supply, which was launched in 1971, and there was 15 people on the picture, not one woman among them. And he just said, this is home. It hasn't changed. That was one story. The other story, just to say in response to yourself, Frank, is my aunt is 96. And I've asked her to write about her time in Piedmont. She spent 5 years in Piedmont during the tuberculosis epidemic here in Ireland, and it sounds very similar. And she speaks about the man who saved her life, and that was Noel Brown. And he challenged the political establishment in order to bring to the fore the plight of the people who are most vulnerable. And I mean, I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from our own recent history in terms of the humanization of poverty. It's not too far from us. Could I mean, we're close enough to when we're going to be called back, but if anybody would like to add anything just to wrap up, we can do that. But I must say, I've really enjoyed the three presentations and the engagement. And I really do, on everybody's behalf, I would like to thank Josephine, Frank, and Dickson for their contributions, and for the rest of you for your attention and for your insights as well.
Yeah. Can I
Trea.
just say one final thing, Paul, just before we go, which is, and it's because of work I've been doing recently on climate action, and it is this whole question of mediating the findings of academic research I don't mean down in a bad way, but to a community level, so that people can engage with the knowledge that's emerging from that research. I think that's a critical thing, and in a way that generates behavior change. That's the crucial point, that it's not knowledge for its own sake. And one of the learnings there, as far as I can understand it, is that engaging with people directly with that knowledge, not broadcasting or publishing it, but actually engaging with people directly with the knowledge, that's our best chance of generating that.
I absolutely agree. Implementation science, isn't that what that's called?
Yeah.
Actually doing something with the research, and that's the same with going in and empowering communities and people feeling disempowered by groups continuously studying vulnerable communities and no change happening. I think as a researcher you have to commit, if you're going to study it, that you do have to enact change. And I think the number one output you should do from research is actually feedback the research to the people that you're studying, first of all, rather than going and submitting an abstract to a conference and then going on to publish it. The so what, that's what myself and my friend call it, and she's an epidemiologist too. You did this study, so what? But you have to ask yourself that every day, like, so what does this mean?
I think you're absolutely right, Julie. And I think one of the questions I think we've always struggled with as researchers, we're often told to be unbiased. We're told to be neutral. But the reality is you cannot be neutral in the face of oppression and the type of oppression that's been described in the tree. So, I mean, I think this concept of activist researchers is a really interesting one as leaders for change rather than as observers and recorders. And I think what I've seen, both in terms of the three inputs, but also in terms of the general thrust from the group, is this is a commitment to change and a commitment to activism, a commitment to grassroots development, a commitment to addressing the range of the Sustainable Development Goals. I am really surprised that I haven't been hauled back into the other room because I've overshot time, or we've overshot time. But again, I do appreciate it. If there's anything else anybody wants to add, let's oh, it's 5 minutes. Good. We have another 5 minutes if anybody'd like to.
I think you sent that 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. No, I think it was 1:30, but we've been given another wee bit of time.
I've a question for people on implementation science as a